The silence in my marriage had a sound. It wasn't the kind you hear, it was the kind you feel. Like walking into a room and forgetting why you came. Like watching someone sleep beside you every night, yet feeling more alone than if the bed were empty. 5 years married to Frank, and somehow, I couldn't remember the last time he looked at me like I was something to marvel at. He used to, in the beginning. When we were dating, he'd brush my hair behind my ear, kiss my forehead absent-mindedly while reading his books, whisper prayers over me when I slept. But somewhere along the line, somewhere between his growing company and his shrinking capacity for intimacy, I became invisible. The woman he once wooed with midnight drives and handwritten notes had turned into someone who blended into the background like wallpaper. I cooked. I cleaned. I smiled at the right times, asked the right questions. I laughed when he made dry jokes, and I kept the peace even when I felt like screaming. It was easier to survive than to stir waters he didn't even care were still. If I protested, he'd sigh, glance at his watch, and tell me we'd talk later. But later never came. It became the graveyard where all my needs went to die. I remember the first time I realized I wasn't really married, I was merely performing the role of a wife. I had made his favorite jollof rice, set the table, lit candles, even dressed in that wine-colored dress he once said made my skin glow. He walked in late, phone pressed to his ear, nodded in my direction, and walked straight to his study.
No smile. No, oni.
Just the sound of his leather shoes echoing against our tiled floors. I sat at the table alone, watching the steam rise from the food I no longer wanted to eat. The candles flickered like they were mocking me. And in that moment, I saw it. The hollow behind his eyes whenever we locked gazes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even unfaithful. He was simply absent. Detached. There, but not there. I was grieving a man who was still alive and sleeping in my bed. I tried to fix it. Suggested date nights. Bought lingerie. Left him notes in his briefcase. But nothing worked. It wasn't that Frank didn't love me. I think he did, in the way someone loves a comfortable chair or an old jacket.
Familiar.
Necessary. But not thrilling. Not worth pursuit. And the sad thing was, I was starting to accept it. I told myself this was adulthood. That this was the cost of stability. That I should be grateful he didn't cheat or raise his voice or hit me. But I was dying quietly. And no one, not even Frank, noticed. It was in those cracks of neglect that loneliness crept in and settled like fog. I stopped talking about my day because Frank never asked. I stopped buying flowers because I realized I was the only one who liked them. I stopped praying with him because he always said he was too tired. Instead, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how love could evaporate without either of us seeing it go. My friends didn't know. My family didn't ask. To the outside world, we looked like the perfect couple. Successful, well-dressed, smiling in pictures. No one knew I spent most nights crying in the shower just to feel something. I became numb. I existed in the margins of my own life, drifting between the woman I used to be and the ghost I had become. And the worst part was, I thought I could live like that forever. Until the day Morris walked through our front door. His smile was sunlight. His voice, warm and curious. He looked at me, not through me, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. I didn't fall in love with him that day. But something shifted. A door opened inside me, and though I didn't walk through it, I stood there, staring into the possibility of more. I didn't know then what that moment would cost me. But I knew this. For the first time in a long time, my heart beat for something other than survival. It was a Saturday soaked in rain and restlessness when Morris entered my world like an uninvited revelation. I remember standing in the hallway with damp hair, arms crossed over a towel, when Frank opened the door and broke into a smile I hadn't seen in years. That smile, the one I had once fallen for, flashed at the sight of his brother, not at me. "Morris," he exclaimed, pulling him into a tight embrace, the kind he'd never given me even during the most celebratory milestones of our marriage. Morris stepped inside, shaking water off his umbrella, and looked around with curious eyes. He was younger than Frank by 5 years but carried a maturity I didn't expect. His eyes, warm and quietly intelligent, landed on me. "You must be Jane," he said, extending a hand. His voice was smooth, not arrogant but self-assured. I nodded, managing a small smile, the towel slipping off my shoulder. "Welcome," I replied, stepping aside to let him in, and something about the way he looked at me in that moment, like I was a person worth noticing, unsettled me. From the beginning, Morris was everything Frank was not: curious, kind, present. He took in our home with genuine interest, asking about our neighborhood, the old framed photo of Frank's graduation on the wall, and the scent of cinnamon that always lingered from my frequent baking. Frank, on the other hand, disappeared into his study almost as soon as the greetings were done, already muttering about a delayed submission for a client. Morris helped me bring his luggage inside, and when I bent to pick up one of his bags, he gently nudged my hand aside. "I've got it," he said with a smile that didn't feel forced. That evening, I made my usual rice and stew, nothing fancy, and set the table while the two men caught up in the living room. I overheard them laughing, actual laughter, from Frank, which used to be my favorite sound. Now, it was foreign, almost offensive. He had laughter in him, he just never wasted it on me. When I called them for dinner, Frank came in first, eyes still on his phone, and began eating without comment. Morris followed, paused at the kitchen door, and looked at the spread with genuine appreciation. "Wow, this looks amazing. Did you cook all this?" I nodded, surprised at the warmth in his tone. He sat down beside Frank, offered a prayer before eating, and asked me questions about my day. I stumbled through my answers, not used to the attention, especially not from someone under our roof. The first few days blurred into one another, but Morris remained a bright spot, a curious deviation in the monotony I had grown numb to. He was respectful, never overstepping, but attentive in a way that chipped away at the walls I'd spent years building. I started noticing things: how he rinsed his plate after dinner without being asked, how he offered to help when I struggled to lift the gas cylinder in the kitchen, how he paused to ask about my music when he overheard me humming one afternoon. He was observant, and it made me uncomfortable, because I was starving for the very thing he was giving so freely. One afternoon, I found him fixing a door hinge that had been squeaking for over a year. I stood there in the hallway, stunned. "Frank never got around to it," I said. Morris shrugged, flashing a grin. "Then I guess it's about time someone did." That night, I lay in bed beside Frank, who was already snoring softly, and stared at the ceiling. A thought I didn't want to entertain formed slowly, dangerously. I had never truly been seen until now. Days morphed into weeks, and with every sunset, it became harder to ignore the new rhythm Morris brought into our home. He was not trying to replace anyone, and yet he was undoing years of silence with the simplest gestures. I found myself lingering in the kitchen longer just to hear his voice float in from the living room. We argued about the best jollof recipe, laughed about Nollywood plot holes, and shared glances that lingered a second too long. I kept telling myself it was innocent, that I was just grateful to not feel invisible. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Frank, in contrast, remained unchanged. He was present only in body. Emotionally, he was a locked vault, and I'd lost the key years ago. He barely noticed how often Morris helped with chores or how often I smiled at the dinner table now. Or maybe he noticed but chose not to care, as though acknowledging it would mean admitting he had failed me. One Thursday evening, while Frank worked late at the office, Morris found me trying to fix a leaking tap under the kitchen sink. I had a wrench in my hand and frustration in my veins. Water splashed in all the wrong places. Morris walked in, took one look, and chuckled. "You're going to flood the kitchen," he said, crouching beside me. I started to protest, but he gently took the wrench from my hands. "Let me," he said, his voice calm. As he worked, our hands brushed. I flinched, not from discomfort, but from how warm it felt. He didn't look at me, but I knew he'd felt it too. Once the leak was fixed, I thanked him, still crouched beside him on the cold floor. Our eyes met, and something passed between us, unspoken, undeniable. I stood too quickly, my breath catching. "I should check the rice," I mumbled, even though dinner was already done. He didn't stop me, but when I turned back from the stove, he was still watching me. I busied myself with the spoons, trying to suppress the rush of emotion flooding my chest. How had things gotten this complicated, this fast? The tension grew in subtle degrees. A brush of the shoulder. A shared laugh. A look that lingered a beat too long. I found myself dressing differently, combing my hair with more care. Not for Frank, he barely noticed when I wore a new blouse, but for Morris, whose compliments were casual but made me feel alive. One night, we sat in the living room after dinner, just the two of us. Frank had gone to bed early, claiming he had an early sight visit. We talked for hours, about dreams, regrets, music, childhood memories. It was intoxicating. But what scared me more than his attention was how easy it was. It shouldn't have been. I was a married woman. He was my brother-in-law. But in that moment, all I saw was a man who listened. Who cared? Who saw me? And I, the wife of another, was beginning to see him too. I don't know when it became dangerous. Maybe it was always dangerous. But I remember the moment it became undeniably real. I had come down with a cold one morning, just a fever and body ache, nothing major, but enough to leave me weak and disoriented. Frank noticed, but only barely. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly, said, "Get some rest," and left for work. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and lemon tea, drifting in and out of sleep. When I opened my eyes later that afternoon, I found Morris standing in the doorway, concern etched into his face. "You look awful," he said with a half-smile, stepping closer. I tried to laugh but ended up coughing. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a fresh cup of tea and sliced oranges. He sat beside me, close but not too close, and handed me the mug. "You need to eat something," he said. I took it from him, my hand grazing his. The contact lingered, even though it shouldn't have. The care Morris offered wasn't flashy. It was quiet, steady, real. That day, he cleaned the kitchen, restocked the fridge with groceries I'd been too tired to buy, and even folded laundry that had been sitting in a basket for 2 days. Frank didn't notice any of it when he came home. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He went straight to the study, muttered something about deadlines, and stayed there all night. Meanwhile, Morris brought me another blanket and turned on a gospel playlist I loved but hadn't listened to in years. I cried quietly that night, not because I was sad, but because I felt like I'd touched something I wasn't meant to. A kind of love that had no business existing in my life. A temptation wrapped in kindness. I wanted it to stop. But I also didn't. A week later, we were in the kitchen again, making dinner together. Frank was running late, again. I stirred the stew while Morris chopped onions. He told a joke about a childhood prank he played on Frank, and I laughed harder than I had in months. As I turned to put the lid on the pot, I lost my grip and nearly burned my hand. Morris was there in a flash, grabbing my wrist and pulling me away from the heat. Our faces were inches apart. The air grew heavy, and the noise of the boiling stew became a distant hum. I could hear my own heartbeat. We didn't kiss. We didn't say a word. But in that charged silence, everything was said. We both pulled back at the same time, shame rushing in like cold water. "I should go for a walk," he said abruptly, dropping the knife and leaving the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, gripping the counter, trembling. Because I knew then, I wasn't just falling. I had already fallen. And if we weren't careful, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were like walking barefoot across a floor made of thorns and velvet. Every interaction with Morris became a paradox, comforting and dangerous, magnetic and terrifying. I found myself thinking about him in stolen moments, his smile surfacing in my mind while I stirred soup or folded laundry. Frank, who had once occupied every room in my heart, now felt like a stranger who only existed on the edge of my routine. He would come home, drop his keys, mutter about traffic or projects, and vanish into his study. I tried to reach out once, tried to touch him, to initiate intimacy. We were in bed, the night unusually quiet. I turned to him, my hand trailing across his chest, but he didn't even look at me. "I'm tired, Jane," he said, flatly. That was it. No kiss.
No explanation.
I curled up beside him, hurt twisting inside me like a knot. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I was expected to live like a widow with a living husband. Morris, unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, kept giving me pieces of something I hadn't realized I missed so deeply. One afternoon, I was baking cinnamon rolls, the aroma filling the house. He walked into the kitchen, sniffed dramatically, and grinned. "That smells like home," he said. My heart caught in my chest. No one had called anything I made home in years. I wiped my hands on a towel, unsure of how to respond. "It's just something I do when I need peace," I admitted. He leaned on the counter, watching me. "You seem like someone who gives more peace than she gets," he said softly. I looked at him, and in that moment, I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a sister-in-law. I was just a woman who had been seen. Really seen. We stood in that kitchen, saying nothing more, but everything inside me shifted. I could feel it, this growing tide that refused to be ignored. I tried to retreat emotionally, but the line between restraint and desire was beginning to blur. And it terrified me. Frank noticed something. Maybe it was how I'd stopped chasing his attention. Or how my silences no longer carried the weight of hope. He began to grow moody, passive-aggressive. He started asking subtle questions. Did Morris say anything about me? Or what do you two always talk about in the kitchen? I answered as plainly as I could, but his eyes lingered, suspicious. Once, he accused me of laughing too much when Morris was around. I brushed it off, but it stung. Because he was noticing not me, but my reaction to someone else. The attention I had begged him to give me for years was now being stirred by jealousy, not affection. And deep inside, I hated how I didn't care anymore. Frank's touch no longer sparked anything but guilt. His indifference had created a cavern inside me, and now, I could feel it filling up with something warm and forbidden. My heart was no longer still, it wandered. It remembered how to beat, how to want, how to feel. And the object of that remembrance wasn't my husband. It was a Sunday afternoon that changed everything, subtle in its unfolding but seismic in what it uncovered. Frank had gone for a work conference out of town, leaving just Morris and me in the house. I told myself it was fine. 2 adults, family, nothing inappropriate. I even invited Ella over to make sure things stayed in neutral territory, but she cancelled last minute, leaving me nervously baking and Morris watching a film in the living room. He called me over to join him, saying he hated watching alone. I hesitated before settling into the chair across from him, deliberately not the couch. The movie was some action flick I didn't care for, but I watched anyway, because his presence had become strangely addictive. At some point, the power went out, and we both groaned. "Typical," I said, standing to grab the rechargeable lantern. But I tripped on the rug, and before I could hit the ground, Morris caught me. His hands were on my waist. My body pressed against his chest. The world froze. Our eyes locked. My breath caught. I could hear his heartbeat. It was fast, uneven. Like mine. For a heartbeat too long, he didn't let go. And neither did I. My hand had curled around his shoulder, and my lips were parted, not to speak, but because they ached to close the space between us. We stood like that, wrapped in heat and trembling restraint, until reason finally broke through. Morris stepped back like he'd touched fire, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't. Nothing was okay. I excused myself to the kitchen, hands shaking, mind spinning. I leaned against the fridge, trying to catch my breath. What had almost happened wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was years of longing rising like a tide I could no longer dam. When I returned to the living room, Morris had disappeared upstairs. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. But something had cracked open, and no matter how much we tried to ignore it, it pulsed between us, alive, undeniable, dangerous. The next few days were awkward, careful. Morris avoided lingering near me. He no longer stayed in the kitchen while I cooked, no longer offered to help with chores. His presence became distant again, and it hurt more than I expected. One night, as I washed dishes alone, I felt tears slip down my cheeks. Not because of guilt, but because I missed him. I missed the way he made me laugh. The way he listened. The way he made the house feel less like a prison. I didn't want to fall for him, but I already had. And now, all I had was silence. Frank returned and noticed none of it. He spoke about the conference, the speakers, the CEO he admired. I nodded, listening but not hearing. My mind was still in that moment. Morris's arms around me, our breath mingling in a world where no one else existed. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just an emotional accident. It was a spark. And sparks, if ignored, turn into fire. The silence between Frank and me was no longer subtle. It was heavy, oppressive, like a fog that hung over the bed we shared but no longer touched. After Morris pulled away, the void he left behind forced me to truly see what my marriage had become, an empty vessel we both kept afloat out of habit, not love. Frank noticed my distance but misread it entirely. He started to try in the most awkward ways, small, stiff compliments, unnecessary questions, his touch suddenly foreign and unsure. I recoiled when he brushed my back in the kitchen one morning, not out of malice, but because it felt like an obligation rather than affection. That night, he climbed into bed beside me and reached out, but I turned away. "You're never in the mood anymore," he whispered bitterly. I wanted to scream, "because I feel nothing from you." But I said nothing. Silence had become our language. And in that silence, my heart whispered someone else's name. Frank's behavior shifted from cold to confrontational. He would question why I spent so much time cooking elaborate meals when it was just dinner, or why Morris seemed more relaxed around me than around him. I denied everything, because technically, there was nothing to confess. We hadn't kissed. We hadn't touched. But emotional betrayal. That line had been crossed long ago. One night, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman I had become. My eyes were tired. My mouth was set in a line too used to faking smiles. I placed a hand over my chest and felt the dull thud of a heart that hadn't known joy in years. I used to believe that faithfulness was about physical boundaries. But now I knew, neglect could also break vows. Frank had stopped choosing me long before I ever noticed Morris. I was just too desperate to be loved to admit it. What kept me awake at night wasn't guilt. It was grief. Grief for the love that once existed between Frank and me, grief for the woman I used to be, hopeful, eager, in love. And grief for the man sleeping 2 rooms away who had accidentally made me feel alive again. I would often lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, wondering how I ended up here. A married woman emotionally entangled with her brother-in-law. It sounded like a scandal ripped from a soap opera, yet it was my reality. The bedroom, once a sanctuary, had become a tomb. I slept beside a man I no longer knew while my heart whispered for another I could never have. And in that darkness, I began to wonder, what happens when staying loyal means slowly dying inside? It was a cold Wednesday night when the truth finally erupted, raw, unfiltered, and as painful as it was necessary. I couldn't sleep, again. The silence in the house was deafening, pressing against my skin like a weight I could no longer carry. I tossed and turned for hours, eyes wide open in the darkness. My thoughts were a cacophony of guilt and desire. Frank had gone to bed early, exhausted from a meeting that had gone badly. I heard his soft snores from down the hall. But my body didn't feel like resting. My soul was restless. I got out of bed, walked barefoot to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there, unmoving. Then I heard footsteps. I turned around, and there he was. Morris. Shirtless, wearing just sweatpants, rubbing his eyes, blinking at me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice husky. I nodded. My throat was too tight for words. He stepped closer. We stood in the dim kitchen light. Too close, too silent. Then I broke. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice cracking. Morris froze, eyes wide. I took a shaky breath. "I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. I can't keep looking at you and acting like you're just my brother-in-law. You're not. You're more." My heart thudded like a warning drum, but I kept going. "I know it's wrong. I know I'm married. But you've seen me in ways Frank never has. I feel safe with you. Alive. And I know I shouldn't be saying this, but if I don't say it now, I'll choke on it." Tears burned in my eyes, and I looked away. Morris didn't speak for a long time. Then I felt his hand on mine, gentle, trembling. "Jane," he began, his voice broken. "I feel it too. God help me, I do." I looked up, shocked. He looked gutted, ashamed. "From the first week I got here, I saw how unhappy you were. How hollow Frank made you. and I kept telling myself to stay away. But every time you laughed, every time you touched my arm or smiled at me, I cracked. He stepped back then, like he needed distance to breathe. Neither of us reached for the other after that. The air was too thick with honesty. The dam had burst, but we were drowning in it. Morris paced for a moment, then sat at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. I can't do this to Frank, he muttered. I can't. I nodded, swallowing back a sob. I know. The tears flowed freely now. Not from shame, but from sorrow. I never wanted this. I just wanted to be loved. That was the moment I realized how broken I was. I had held on for years to a man who never saw me and fell for the only one who did, but couldn't have him. Morris stood and wrapped his arms around me, not with lust, but with grief. We clung to each other like people clinging to the edge of a cliff, knowing we couldn't hold on forever. And then, without a word, he walked upstairs. And I stood in the kitchen alone, hollowed out by the weight of my truth. The next morning, the house felt wrong, empty, tense, too quiet even for our usual dysfunction. I moved through the rooms in a fog, eyes swollen from crying, heart heavy like wet wool wrapped around my ribs. Frank had already left for work by the time I made it downstairs. I found Morris in the living room, a duffel bag beside him. My stomach twisted. What are you doing? I asked, though I already knew. He looked at me with those soft, tired eyes that had become my safe place, and gave a sad smile. I'm going, Jane. I have to. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. He stood and walked over to me. I didn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what we said, what we feel, and I realized that staying here would only make things worse for both of us. He looked away, jaw clenched. If I stay, I'll cross a line I won't be able to come back from. And I can't be that man. Not to Frank. Not to you. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes again. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him we could find a way to fix it, to hide it, to make it work. But I didn't. Because I knew he was right. Loving him wasn't the problem. The problem was that I was already someone else's wife, and he was my husband's brother. The ache inside me was sharp and merciless. Where will you go? I whispered. A friend of mine has a place in town, he said. Just until my contract ends. Then I'll leave the city. The finality of it hit me like a brick to the chest. You're leaving the city? I repeated, stunned. He nodded. It's the only way I'll be able to move on. And give you space to figure out what you really want. Without me clouding your heart. I stepped closer, desperate. But you love me. He looked at me then, and the pain in his eyes broke me. That's exactly why I have to go. He walked out the door 30 minutes later. Just a nod, a soft take care of yourself, and the sound of his footsteps fading into nothing. When the door closed, it felt like a coffin slamming shut. I fell to the floor and cried, not just for Morris, but for everything. For my broken marriage. For the woman I used to be. For the years I had wasted waiting for Frank to love me. When Frank returned later that evening, he barely noticed the change. Where's Morris? He asked while scrolling through emails. I stared at him, numb. He left, I said flatly. He paused, looked up. Oh, why? I shrugged. Said he needed space. Frank grunted and went back to his screen. And just like that, the man I loved had vanished, and my husband hadn't even blinked. It rained the next night, hard, brutal, relentless. The kind of rain that drowns the streets and forces everything to stop. I sat by the window, knees tucked under my chin, watching the water blur the world outside. Inside, the storm was louder. My mind was a battlefield, filled with regrets, unspoken words, and the overwhelming silence that had returned after Morris's departure. I hadn't heard from him. I didn't expect to. And yet, every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt with false hope. Frank sat across the room, flipping through TV channels with disinterest, occasionally glancing at me. We hadn't spoken much since Morris left. The house, once too full, now felt hollow. I wondered if Frank noticed. If he missed his brother. If he knew what had almost happened. I studied his face for any trace of knowing, but there was nothing. Just that same passive distance I'd known for years. The breaking point came over something so mundane it was laughable. Dinner. I had made okra soup with pounded yam, Frank's favorite. He came to the table late, glanced at the plate, and frowned. You used too much oil, he said, pushing the food around with his spoon. That was it. That was the match to the powder keg. I stood up, the chair scraping violently across the floor. That's what you noticed? I said. He looked at me, confused. What? I laughed bitterly. I make your favorite meal. I sit here, in this house you barely live in. I beg for scraps of your attention. And all you can say is I used too much oil. He blinked, stunned. Jane, what's this about? I slammed my palms on the table. It's about the fact that I'm done, Frank. I'm done begging. Done being invisible. Done being your roommate who just happens to do your laundry and cook your meals. His expression hardened. Is this about Morris? My breath caught. There it was. The unspoken finally voiced. Yes, I whispered. And no. It's about you. About how for 5 years I've been drowning in this marriage and you never even noticed. Morris was just the first person who did. Frank stood, his face dark with something between rage and shock. So you're cheating on me? I shook my head. No. But I wanted to. And that should terrify you. We stared at each other, decades of silence crashing between us. Then I turned and walked away.
Upstairs, you packed a bag.
Called Ella. She said yes before I could finish asking. I left the house in the rain, not looking back. As the taxi pulled away, I saw Frank standing in the doorway, watching. Not calling. Not stopping me. Just standing there, like he'd finally realized his wife had left not because of another man, but because of the woman she was becoming. The first few days at Ella's apartment were a strange blend of silence and tenderness. She didn't ask too many questions at first, only offered me warm food, clean sheets, and the freedom to cry when I needed to. I slept most of the time, curled up like a child, the weight of everything pressing against my lungs. The house I'd lived in for years was gone, just like that. My marriage wasn't over in a legal sense, but in my heart, I'd already buried it. Ella sat with me often in the evenings, brushing my hair, holding my hand. Sometimes we spoke. Sometimes we didn't. But on the 5th night, as we lay on the couch watching reruns of some drama I couldn't name, my phone buzzed. I froze. My heart leapt into my throat. Slowly, I picked it up. It was an unknown number. My hands trembled as I opened the message. You left. That was all it said. 2 words, and I knew it was Morris. My entire body reacted. My stomach flipped, my heart clenched, my hands went cold. I stared at the screen like it was haunted. Ella noticed the shift in me and gently took the phone from my hand. She read the message and sighed, setting it down on the coffee table. He's still here, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. I knew it. He never left town. My eyes widened. What? She nodded. He's been at Hotel Endura. Room 204. Hasn't checked out. A friend of mine works there. Her voice was calm, but there was a glimmer of warning in her tone. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to add to your storm. But I knew if you found out, you'd go. I sat up, my breath catching. Why would he stay? She shrugged. Maybe he wanted to make sure you were okay. Maybe he couldn't bring himself to leave. My mind raced, the familiar ache of longing flooding me. I have to see him, I whispered. Ella didn't stop me. She just helped me grab a jacket and handed me a pack of tissues before I left. The rain had stopped, but the air outside was cold and wet. I took a cab, heart pounding the entire ride. My fingers curled and uncurled in my lap, nerves exploding like sparks beneath my skin. By the time I reached the hotel, it was past 9 p.m. I stood in the lobby for what felt like hours, trying to gather the courage to go up. Eventually, I made my way to the 2nd floor, walked the long hallway, and stopped at room 204. I stared at the door. My hand hovered near the wood. I was about to knock when it opened from the inside. Morris stood there, as though he'd been waiting. Neither of us spoke. His eyes searched mine. I didn't cry. He didn't smile. But in that charged silence, we said everything we didn't know how to say aloud. Morris stepped aside and let me in, his movements slow and careful, like he was afraid I might disappear. The room was dimly lit, a single bedside lamp casting a warm glow across the beige walls. It smelled like him, soap, cologne, and something earthy. The bed was neatly made, untouched. He hadn't been sleeping much either. I stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do with my hands, my thoughts, my presence. He closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you are." I looked at him, my throat thick. "Why didn't you leave?" He gave a sad smile, one that didn't touch his eyes. "Because I needed to know you were okay. Because I'm a coward. Because I couldn't let go." I moved closer, not sitting, just watching him like he was both a stranger and a memory I couldn't shake. We talked for hours that night. There was no touching, no crossing lines. Just two people peeling back the layers of everything they had hidden. I told him about the night I left, about how Frank didn't even try to stop me. Morris told me about growing up always in his brother's shadow, about how he had never been jealous of Frank until he met me. "It's ironic," he said. "All my life, he had the success, the charm, the approval. I never wanted any of it. And then he had you, and for the first time, I wanted something that was his." I didn't know what to say to that. The guilt was fresh, but so was the understanding. We weren't monsters. We were just two broken people who had collided at the worst possible time. And in that collision, something real had formed. Something beautiful, even if forbidden. But Morris was still Morris, principled, selfless. He leaned back against the headboard and looked at me, his voice thick. "I love you, Jane. I've never been more sure of anything. But I can't be the reason your marriage ends." I wanted to scream. To tell him it wasn't just about Frank anymore. That it was about me, about who I was when I was with Morris versus who I became in the cold grip of my husband. But I didn't. Because he wasn't asking me to choose him. He was asking me to choose myself. We fell asleep on opposite sides of the bed, our backs to each other but our hearts somehow pressed together. In the morning, I left before the sun rose. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I walked out of Hotel 204 with a tear-streaked face and a mind full of everything that could never be. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt like I was beginning to see myself again, outside of Frank, outside of Morris. Just me. Raw, unsure, and finally awake. Returning to Ella's apartment felt different this time. The room didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a sanctuary, a place to recover rather than retreat. I sank into the couch, exhausted beyond the physical. I wasn't just mourning Morris or my marriage, I was mourning the version of myself I had abandoned for so long. Ella handed me a notebook and pen that evening. "Write," she said softly. "You need to meet yourself again." And so, I began journaling. At first, it was scattered thoughts, blurred memories, fragments of pain, questions that had no answers. But then, words started to pour out of me like a dam had burst. I wrote about how invisible I'd felt in my own home. How I'd withered under Frank's indifference. How I had clung to the affection of another man because it was the only warmth I'd been offered in years. In therapy, I said things I hadn't even said to myself. My therapist, a quiet woman with soft brown eyes named Temi, listened without judgment. She asked questions that cracked me open gently. "When did you stop being Jane?" she asked one day. I cried for 10 minutes before I could answer. The day I realized I had to dim myself just to keep the peace. We explored the roots of my self-abandonment, the way I had measured my worth by how little space I took up, how much I served, how well I performed. I was learning that love without respect is just bondage with pretty wallpaper. And no matter how much Morris loved me, I couldn't walk into another relationship with open wounds and broken boundaries. I had to become whole first, for me. Only then would I be able to make any choice with clarity. And that terrified me. Because what if wholeness meant walking away from both men? Over time, I started doing things just for myself again. Long walks, solo lunches, gospel music blasting in my headphones. I went makeup shopping, took hot baths, even danced alone in the living room. I was slowly, painfully becoming a woman I liked again. I didn't know what would happen with Frank. I didn't know if Morris would ever stop feeling like a ghost in my heart. But I was learning to sit in the questions instead of rushing to answers. I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't my feelings for Morris. It was how long I had betrayed myself. How I had silenced my joy, doubted my worth, allowed my light to be dimmed in the name of duty. That woman was gone. And in her place, a new version of Jane was emerging. Not perfect, not polished, but finally, undeniably present. It was a quiet Thursday morning when I saw his name flash on my phone for the first time in weeks. I stared at the screen for a full minute, unsure if I should answer. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, part dread, part curiosity, and a part one hated to admit, hope. I answered on the third ring, bracing myself for whatever storm he might bring. But when I spoke and heard his voice, I didn't hear a storm. I heard a man unraveling. "Jane," he said softly, "I don't know how to start this, but I need to see you." There was something cracked in his voice, a hesitance that I had never heard before. Frank, the man who had always spoken with conviction, even when he was wrong, now sounded like he was treading through a minefield. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I only asked, "Why now?" He sighed. "Because I saw what I was becoming. And it scared me." I didn't know what that meant, not fully. But I agreed to meet him for coffee. Nothing more. We met at a quiet cafe tucked behind the bookstore I used to love. I wore a simple dress, no makeup, hair pulled back, because I didn't want to impress him. I just wanted to be seen. When Frank walked in, he looked smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who had been humbled in ways words couldn't explain. He sat across from me and didn't touch his drink. "I've started seeing a therapist," he said before anything else. "Morris gave me her number before he left." My heart jolted at the mention of Morris, but I didn't interrupt. Frank continued, slowly and awkwardly. "She asked me when I stopped feeling. And I realized it happened a long time ago, maybe before we even got married. I built walls and called it survival. I made work my God. I made you my obligation." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and I couldn't look away. "You deserved more. And I gave you less than nothing." For the first time in our marriage, I heard accountability without defensiveness. There were no excuses. No blame. Just raw, painful truth. Tears welled in my eyes, not because I forgave him, but because I could finally see him. Not the cold man I had begged for scraps of affection. Not the indifferent husband who lived like a ghost in our home. But a flawed, hurting human being finally trying to pick up the wreckage he had caused. "Why now?" I whispered. He swallowed. "Because when you left, something in me broke. And I knew if I didn't fix it, I'd become the man my father was. And I hated him for what he did to my mother." His voice cracked, and for the first time, Frank cried in front of me. I didn't touch him. I didn't console him. But I stayed. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. Not because trust was restored, it wasn't. Not because love came rushing back, it didn't. But because I saw the smallest seed of possibility. Not for the old version of us. But maybe, just maybe, for something new. A week after our meeting at the cafe, Frank called again. His voice was steadier, but still careful. "Come for dinner. Just dinner. No expectations." I hesitated, but eventually agreed. When I arrived, I barely recognized the house. It wasn't that the furniture had changed, it hadn't, but the energy was different. There were candles on the table, soft music playing in the background, and the smell of burnt something wafting from the kitchen. I almost laughed when I saw Frank in an apron, panicking over a pot of stew that looked more like regret soup. He turned, flustered and embarrassed. "I tried. I followed YouTube," he mumbled. "It's horrible, isn't it?" I smiled, genuinely, for the first time in a long while. It's a disaster, I said, walking over. But you cooked. That matters. There was something tender in the moment, something achingly human. He looked at me, not as his wife, not as the woman he had taken for granted, but as someone whose presence he was now desperate to deserve. We ended up ordering takeout, laughing over soggy jollof rice and a slightly burnt plantain. It wasn't the food that filled the silence, it was the honesty. For the first time, we talked like two people trying to meet again after years apart. I asked him why he had been so emotionally unavailable, and he told me stories I had never heard, about his childhood, the pressure of success, the fear of failure, and how love had always felt transactional to him. I didn't know how to give you what I never saw growing up, he admitted. I thought providing was enough. I didn't know love needed language. I told him about the years I spent fading in the background, about how Morris made me feel seen again, not loved, necessarily, but alive. He flinched but didn't recoil. He didn't accuse. He just nodded slowly and said, I know. That acknowledgement, simple but profound, felt like the beginning of something healing. We didn't sleep in the same bed that night. I left after dinner, kissed him gently on the cheek, and walked away with a heart that felt both heavier and lighter. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a fresh start. But it was a step toward understanding. The next morning, I found a note in my bag. Frank had written, "Thank you for choosing to hear me. I'm not trying to win you back. I'm trying to earn the right to be beside you, even if just as someone who finally saw you." I cried reading it, not because it fixed everything, but because for the first time, I believed him. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He was, in his own broken way, trying to redeem the future. And that made all the difference. Returning to that house after weeks away was like stepping into a stranger's home wearing a familiar face. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The walls, once cold and indifferent, now held a hesitant warmth. Frank met me at the door, not with demands or expectations, but with a quiet question, "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I'm not coming back to what we had. I'm coming to see if we can build something new." He didn't touch me, didn't press. He simply said, "Then let's begin again." That night, we slept in separate rooms. Not as punishment, but as part of the rebuilding. We were learning each other from scratch. I had boundaries now, firm ones, and he respected them. There were awkward silences, missteps, moments where the past echoed loudly. But there was also effort. Honest effort. And that mattered more than grand gestures. Frank started joining me for therapy. Not every session, but enough to show commitment. He asked questions. He listened. He cried, more than once. I saw a man peeling back years of armor, learning how to speak the language of vulnerability. One evening, after a particularly heavy session, he looked at me and said, "I know you may never love me the way you once did. And I'm okay with that. I just want to be someone who can love you well, even if it takes a lifetime to learn how." His humility disarmed me. I had spent so long bracing for impact with Frank that I didn't know how to receive gentleness from him. But it was there now, in small gestures. Morning coffee placed beside my journal. Random texts just checking in. Little sticky notes with encouragement left on the bathroom mirror. He wasn't perfect. Sometimes, he reverted to old habits, like shutting down when overwhelmed. But when I called him out, he didn't deflect. He apologized. And tried again. It was strange, rediscovering the man I had once promised forever to. Strange, and beautiful in a broken glass kind of way. We laughed more. We cried more. We even argued, but differently now. With honesty, not hostility. With the goal of understanding, not winning. One Saturday morning, I found him sitting on the porch with my journal in his hands. I froze, about to protest, but he looked up with tears in his eyes. "I didn't mean to invade your space. I wanted to know you better." I sat beside him, and we talked, for hours. About everything. About nothing. About the ashes we were standing on and the home we wanted to build. It was hard. It was tender. It was real. And for the first time, I believed that maybe we could rise, not as the couple we were, but as the people we were becoming. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a message, simple and to the point: "I'm leaving town. Can we talk?" My hands trembled as I read the words, the past rushing toward me like a sudden storm. I hadn't seen Morris in over a month, not since that night in the hotel room when we sat across from each other, hearts full and hands restrained. I stared at the message for hours before replying with a single word: yes. That evening, we met at the same bench by the waterfront where we once shared stories of childhood and dreams that weren't ours to keep. Morris looked older, wearier, but his eyes still held that calm kindness I had come to depend on. "I'm leaving for Abuja," he said softly. "Got a job offer. A clean slate." I nodded, throat tight. "I thought you already left," I whispered. He smiled faintly, the sadness in it cutting deeper than any blade. "I couldn't. Not until I knew you were okay." There was a long silence between us, not awkward, but sacred. We both knew this moment would come. It had always been inevitable. The truth was that I had loved Morris, not with lust or recklessness, but with a tender ache born from being seen. In his eyes, I had rediscovered pieces of myself I thought were gone. But it was also in his absence that I had learned to walk again on my own. "You saved me," I said finally. "When I was drowning, you pulled me out without even touching me." Morris didn't answer right away. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "This is for you," he said. "For later. Not now." I took it without opening it, already feeling the weight of it in my heart. He stood up, and I did too. We didn't hug. We didn't kiss. We just looked at each other, really looked. "You were my miracle, Jane," he said. "But miracles aren't always meant to stay. Some are just meant to awaken." After he left, I sat on that bench until the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered to life. I held the letter in my lap, unsure if I could bear to read it. But when I finally opened it that night, tears streamed down my face. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a blessing. He wrote of forgiveness, of freedom, of how love sometimes teaches us by letting go. "If you ever think of me, don't think of what we could have been. Think of what we became because we didn't cross that line. You found your strength, and I found my peace." The letter ended with a quote I now carry in my soul: "Some loves are not meant to be held. They're meant to heal." I cried myself to sleep that night, not in regret, but in release. Morris was gone, but the part of me that he brought to life was finally mine to keep. We were sitting in the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken truths. I had carried this confession like a stone in my chest, afraid of what it might break. But I couldn't continue building something new on a foundation still hiding old fractures. "There's something you deserve to know," I said, voice trembling. "About Morris." Frank looked up, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said, bracing himself. And so I told him, not to hurt him, not to punish, but to lay bare the truth. I told him about the connection, the longing, the moments we shared that never crossed the line but nearly did. I told him how Morris had respected him even when Frank didn't deserve it, how he had walked away instead of destroying what little was left. When I finished, Frank sat silently for what felt like forever. Then he got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. "I knew something was there," he said quietly. "I didn't want to admit it, but I knew." I waited for the anger, the accusations, the eruption. But it never came. Instead, Frank turned around, leaning against the counter with a weary sigh. "It hurts," he admitted. "But what hurts more is knowing I created the space where this even became possible." He walked back to the couch and sat beside me. "I don't hate you, Jane. I hate the version of me who made you feel invisible." I wept, not because he forgave me so easily, but because he didn't look at me with disgust or bitterness. He looked at me like someone who understood what real accountability required. "Do you still love him?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. I loved what he reminded me I deserved. "But I chose you. I'm still choosing you." That was the truth. Morris had awakened my hunger for love. But it was Frank who stood before me now, willing to learn how to give it. Not perfectly, not easily, but wholeheartedly. From that day on, our healing took on a new rhythm. We no longer tiptoed around the pain. We addressed it head on. Therapy sessions became deeper, more confrontational, but also more cleansing. Frank asked questions about what I needed, what I feared, what I longed for. And for the first time, I gave honest answers. No filters. No performance. Just truth. We began journaling together, sometimes writing letters to each other instead of speaking. It helped. It gave us language we hadn't known how to use aloud. Slowly, trust began to root itself again. Not the naive kind we had on our wedding day, but the earned kind, tempered by truth, tested by failure, and held together by the decision to keep showing up. And that kind of trust was far more sacred. Frank planned it all in secret, an overnight stay at a secluded cabin 2 hours outside the city. No phones. No distractions. Just the two of us and the tentative love we were learning to nurture. I almost said no when he told me. The thought of being alone with him, completely alone, still brought up fear. But he looked at me and said, "If it's too much, we won't go. Your safety comes first." That was new. That was growth. And that's why I said yes. The drive was quiet but comfortable. We listened to music, pointed out silly billboards, and shared stories of our childhood. When we arrived, the cabin was cozy and warm, with a fireplace already lit and a small kitchen stocked with essentials. Frank cooked us a simple dinner, spaghetti and plantain, and we ate on the wooden deck beneath the stars. It was the first night in years where I felt cherished. Not claimed. Not needed. Just loved. That evening, we sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea. "Do you remember when we were first dating?" Frank asked, smiling faintly. "You used to wear that blue dress with the buttons down the front. I hated how men looked at you in it, but I loved how you looked in it." I laughed, surprised he remembered. "I wore that dress the night you proposed." He nodded. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. But somewhere along the way, I stopped treating you like a gift. I treated you like furniture, always there, never needing attention. His voice broke slightly. I reached over and took his hand. I stopped asking for what I needed. "That's on me too," I replied. We sat like that for hours, two souls trying to find a rhythm that didn't feel rehearsed. And when we finally kissed, it wasn't out of obligation. It was a soft, slow rediscovery. Like rain falling after a drought. We made love that night, not like strangers clinging to a memory, but like partners writing a new beginning. There were tears. There were apologies. There was laughter. The next morning, I woke up to Frank tracing the lines of my palm like a map he was still trying to read. "I don't want to go back," he said. "I want to move forward, even if we stumble." I smiled and whispered, "Then let's keep stumbling forward." The ride home was quiet again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was peaceful. We had turned a corner. Not into perfection, but into presence. We were learning how to choose each other, day by day, breath by breath. And as I looked at him driving, sunlight kissing the side of his face, I realized something. This man, flawed, wounded, but trying, was finally becoming the partner I had always hoped for. And I was no longer afraid of being loved well. It's been 7 months since that night at the cabin. The night Frank and I finally chose each other again, not out of duty or convenience, but from a place of awakened honesty. Life hasn't suddenly become a fairy tale. We still argue. He still forgets to soak his laundry, and I still get irritable when I'm overwhelmed. But something is profoundly different now. We've both changed. We see each other, really see each other. Frank has continued his therapy, even when work gets demanding. I've kept writing in my journal, kept attending my support group, and most importantly, I've continued speaking my needs out loud instead of hoping someone would magically understand my silence. There's a transparency between us that never existed before. We've built a language of trust, not just from words, but from action. He doesn't just say, "I love you" anymore, he shows it. Whether it's how he listens when I'm anxious, or how he holds me when I wake from a bad dream, Frank now loves with intention, not assumption. One Sunday afternoon, while sitting on our balcony, I found myself watching him read a book he never would have touched a year ago. the emotionally present man. He was highlighting passages, pausing to think, even scribbling in the margins. I couldn't help but smile. There was something almost poetic about the way this man, who once couldn't look up from his phone long enough to ask how my day was now diving into the ocean of emotional growth just to understand me better. "I'm still learning how to love you right," he had told me one morning as we shared coffee. "But every day, I wake up hoping to do it a little better than yesterday." That statement struck me deeply. Because love, I've come to realize, isn't static. It doesn't just exist, it must be nourished, tended, and re-earned with every shared silence, every moment of humility, every awkward apology. It's a garden that only blooms when both hands are in the soil. And for the first time, both of ours are. Sometimes I think about Morris, where he is now, whether he's found peace, someone to love, or maybe even a piece of home in his new city. I still have his letter, tucked safely in the pages of my journal, not because I read it often, but because it represents something precious. The moment I realized I was worth more than endurance. I don't look back with shame. I look back with gratitude. Because it was through that forbidden, unfulfilled love that I began to understand what I truly needed, not just from others, but from myself. Frank may be the man I married, but today, he is no longer just my husband. He is my partner, my witness, my fellow traveler. And I am no longer the silent, invisible wife I once was. I am a woman reborn from ashes, forged by fire, and softened by grace. This is what love should be. Not perfect. Not painless. But honest, brave, and chosen again and again. For anyone listening, any woman quietly breaking beneath the weight of emotional neglect, I say this: your voice matters. Your joy matters. And love, the kind that sees you, hears you, and honors you, is not too much to ask for. It's the bare minimum. Never settle for anything less. Thanks for watching Afro Stories. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to leave a like and comment.